Thank you everyone for being here this morning. I'd like to say I can't say it's a pleasure to be done with the session. It hasn't been an enjoyable session from the minority, as you might imagine. We've seen a number of things that we pretty clearly disagree with and have pushed back against, from an operating budget that frankly overspends and creates bow wave issues in the future, to capital gains income tax that goes out of its way to ban the public from weighing in a referendum with a stealth referendum ban built into the language, to an attempt to affect our climate, a wrong-headed attempt, I might say, in a way that's going to be enormously regressive and drive the cost of living up for families around the state of Washington. And then on top of that, a number of other individual bills that just, again, add cost of living to housing and many other things that our families around the state of Washington are struggling with. So I think that it's certainly disappointing in that respect for me. I'd add to that the disappointment that we did this in a session that didn't have the transparency many of us would have liked and were concerned about from the beginning. And we frankly just outright failed to address the lessons we've learned over the last year on emergency powers, and left the legislature out of the discussion. As we end the session, we go back to one-person rule with the governor calling all the shots until he decides that the crisis is over, or the emergency is over. So I know that doesn't sound very hopeful, but I'm not feeling particularly hopeful this morning because of all the very partisan issues that were crammed through the legislative session over the last 105 days. So I came a little bit late to this party, so I don't know who's next, but I will turn it back to Kim to direct us in the next to the next person.
Well, thank you, and I'll kick it over to Representative Wilcox.
Thank you very much, Kim, and it's good to be done, and it's also good to see all of you again. I hope that we find a way to get together during the interim more than we normally do. I think as I look back on this session, there's two things that I really regret, honestly. We started off the session under emergency orders, and we finished the session under a state of emergency with absolutely no changes to that situation. In fact, it's worse, because the first bill out was one that just automatically extended legislative approval for the small number of ones that are subject to review until the end of the state of emergency, which is up to no one but the governor. That just doesn't seem like the way we do government in the United States and the state of Washington. The other thing that I think I really regret is we started a session off surrounded by wire and fences and gates and guards, and we finished the session exactly the same way. I don't think that there's any reason at all that we had to finish up under this kind of intimidating security. And I think we absolutely have to work hard to get back to the kind of government that people expect, and that I think we are perfectly safe in conducting ourselves as. That's it for me. Looking forward to all your questions.
Okay, with that, we will start off with Rachel LaCourte from the AP.
Hi, good morning. I did want to ask you about one of the issues that was not taken up this session, and that was the transportation revenue package that at least Democratic leaders indicated yesterday will be addressed at some point, whether it's a special session later this year or during next session. Just wanted to know where your caucuses stood on that. Do you want to see a revenue package, and kind of what would that entail in your mind?
We've been very clear from the start of the session. We are supportive of a transportation package, and we offered, I think, a very thoughtful and complete proposal to put $24 billion into transportation over the next 16 years, by far the largest funding package and the most straightforward for the citizens of the state of Washington. That was built into our budget proposal, 2.5 months ago almost now. and not just an idea, but laid out to make sure that the operating budget would continue to grow at historic rates and make sure we didn't have any cuts, but also put new and stable funding into transportation. We remain committed to finding a path to transportation, although we strongly disagree with the path they're currently on, which would result in anywhere from 60 cents to over $2 of additional gas tax to the people of the state of Washington, with relatively little to show in the terms of actual investment in transportation. So we want to get there on transportation, but we think we're on the wrong path right now. So we'll keep working during the interim to find a path that is suitable and gets us there in a way that's reasonable and responsible for the state of Washington.
Yeah, and I would say from the House perspective, our budget envisioned the same thing. And I want to say, I think one of the really positive things that came out of this session was the fact that the minority parties in both chambers published operating budgets very early in the process, showed that you could do it. I think that gave our ideas a fair amount of initiative, and there are some things that are good in this budget that came out of those ideas. Transportation ended up being fairly bipartisan, as it often is. But I think the most outrageous thing that came out of this session is the idea that these three policies are tied together. The low carbon fuel standard, or the high cost fuel standard, the cap and tax, and the potential for a gas tax for construction. What are people thinking about? How on earth can you have a session that is cast in progressive terms, and then you put together something that piles on top all those costs in the most regressive possible way for people that are not fortunate enough to live next to a transportation node? I think outrageous doesn't even cover it. That's an insult to people that just want to find a place that they can afford to live and raise a family, and can't find a job right next door. So they get on our freeways, and they're going to be asked to pay, if these things happen, 60 or 70 cents or more per gallon. Not fair at all. House Republicans will not support anything that piles those costs on top.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that really quick, I said on the floor yesterday that this keeps getting called the grand bargain, but I'm not sure who it's a bargain for. Maybe a few select green energy companies, maybe for progressive activists, but certainly not for any of my constituents, most of whom commute into Seattle or Tacoma. And as JT mentioned, if a gas tax passes, it'll be not just the gas tax itself, but it'll trigger additional fuel costs through the low carbon fuel standard and cap and trade. Latest estimate I saw, between the three things would be about $1.05. I would be extremely disappointed, to put it mildly, if for the last year Democrats said we couldn't come back to special session to address some of the urgent circumstances created by coronavirus, but now they're willing to come back to special session to raise a regressive tax by $1.
Rachel, did you have a follow-up?
Just a quick one for JT and Senator Braun. I know you guys mentioned the concern about access for the public, but we saw in some other legislatures that, Oregon, I think Idaho for a while, they had to shut down because of COVID cases. And one thing Senator Billig did mention yesterday, that this session, we did not see any cases of COVID in the legislature that impacted the work you were able to do. So looking at how you did finish on time, I know you weren't happy with everything that came out of the session, but is there something that do you regret that it was done that way, considering that there was no illness that we know among staff or lawmakers that did impact your work? Do you still think that there should have been more people in the building during this time?
Well, I will say that I thought the Senate did a better job than the House. You could go over to the Senate and see quite a few people interacting safely and working as a team. And I think you saw the two caucuses in the Senate actually having a fair amount of productive conversation, both on and off the floor. The House was so shut down. You could look out there and you would see two people. I think that this was the perfect session to the circumstances were perfected in a way that made it possible to implement the most progressive possible agenda. And your question about health, absolutely, health was paramount to many of us, but it, I think, was proven by the Senate that you could do it in a more collaborative way than we saw in the House, where there was almost a total shutdown in terms of allowing people on the floor.
Yeah, and it's impossible to prove a negative. Could we been even more open and not had illness? No way to know that. What we do know is when you look at broadly, you compare the some of the draconian methods we've had statewide in Washington to the much more open approach to, for instance, the state of Florida, with largely the same results. You have to wonder. I do, and I'm always careful when taking credit in the Senate over the House, but I do think we were marginally better because we had a certain amount of people on the floor. What we could have had more, and we could have had some limited public access, and we do it every day in public buildings around the state. I think we absolutely could have done that in a safe fashion, and we should have. We could have had ways to come to Olympia and testify in a safe fashion. We could have, and we didn't. We could have evaluated as vaccines rolled out. Can we change some of the abilities to access the legislature? We could have, and we didn't. So again, nobody knows, and I'm certainly grateful and proud of the fact that we got through without any health issues in the legislature. But I do think we could have reasonably gone further and given the public more access. And I don't know whether they would have taken it. That's not the point. The point is they could have.
Okay. Next, I will go with Essex Porter. Go ahead, Essex.
Hello, good morning. Representative Wilcox, just to follow on what you were saying, do you mean to say that Democrats locked their agenda in by locking people out of the legislature?
I think that the circumstances under which we operated made it much easier to implement an agenda.
I would add to that, when you actually look at the voting record and the partisan nature of this session versus previous sessions, you'll see a decided path. It was much more partisan than historically it has been, and done with less transparency, as we've talked about, than previous sessions.
And on one of the substantive issues, I would like some response to what was done on police reform, a package of legislation, certainly historic, but what concerns now do folks have when this legislation has all been passed?
I'd like to defer the House to Representative Maycomber, who is one of the very few people in this building that has actual law enforcement experience.
Thank you, Essex, for that question. 1310 and 1054 really looked at tightening up law enforcement abilities to work on the streets and some of those more difficult situations. You see in the policies that we've had in the last 48 hours, moved up the chain of command on whether or not you could use pepper spray and some of those tear gas and those issues when you're looking at large crowds. Moving up the chain of command is fine, but they were put on elected officials, and we don't know whether those elected officials understand that capacity. Policing right now is in a very difficult position. They are to protect and serve, and they know they may have to lay down their lives for individuals every single day. Unfortunately, the job is becoming less desirable, and when a job becomes less desirable, you get less desirable candidates. What we need to do is we need to really build up the profession to get the best candidates. And you'll see House Bill 1001, my policy was signed by the governor last week, to look at getting more diversity in law enforcement and really building up those communities that haven't been heard. When you open it up and build up those communities that need a voice within law enforcement to protect and serve in the next generation, you start seeing a more incorporated policing model, and that's a community policing model. And I've been an advocate for it since I've entered the legislature. Unfortunately, Washington State has not devoted time and funds to really build up law enforcement in the state of Washington. We're 50th in the nation for law enforcement per capita. You see reactionary policing, not because law enforcement isn't trying, but because they're going from call to call to call and they're unable to do a community policing model. You see 2 years ago, my policy to increase academy classes and doubled passed and has now been implemented. Unfortunately, those slots cannot be filled at this time. And I think you've seen the recent notifications that you see law enforcement leaving the profession in drones. So we really want to build up that that law enforcement officer that wants to serve his community, that wants to serve the area and their families and the businesses, and do it with a servant's heart. And that starts with the community policing. We continually talk about getting out the bad players, the difficult players, the ones that don't belong, but we forgot about everyone else, the 90% that are doing the best they can and that are risking their lives. And now it's time that we start talking about those people that are serving our communities and protecting us. So I do worry about the profession of law enforcement officers and crime in our communities and our children and what will occur as a response. But we need to start now building up the profession.
And to be clear, are you saying that the legislation that's passed will drive more law enforcement officers from the profession?
I have fears that it makes it more difficult. There's definitely policies that we needed to look at, but when you have to stop a car during a pursuit that you see a crime occurring, it's a felony, and you have to stop and make a call. Who's going to be injured when that car is fleeting? Who's going to be injured when you have to call someone that knows little to nothing about law enforcement to implement the policies that have been to de-escalate some major issues? So unfortunately, sometimes we pass policies without understanding what's occurring at the time. Many people haven't been in that scenario, in that situation. And if we stop allowing law enforcement to stop individuals, to stop them from committing further crimes, you see some of these headlines that you've seen recently where individuals that continue to increase their crime sprees, and our families and our communities are not better for it.
Thank you.
All right, next we'll go to Sarah Gensler with McClatchy.
Thanks, Kim. The question about bipartisanship, and Senator Braun, you referred to this a little bit, but yesterday I asked Democrats about bipartisan legislation this session, and they gave a long list of bills. Of course, the Working Families Tax Credit and the capital and transportation budgets, but also, the wildfire bill, farm worker overtime, unemployment insurance. But basically the conclusion was it's actually easier to point out the efforts that weren't bipartisan than to try to list off the ones that were. So I just want to hear more commentary, I guess, on the general spirit of collaboration this session, because it does feel quite a few bipartisan efforts did get through. So you can just kind of contextualize your earlier comments with the larger sort of efforts there.
Hey, John, before you start in, may I make a comment to Sarah? I apologize for interrupting you, but Sarah, something that I would like for you to consider is that the bipartisan deals that were struck were then, at least on one occasion, undone in the House by the very member who struck the deal going over to the House and getting the deal undone, or even worse, the governor undoing the deal, reverting it back to solely Democrat policy. So again, John, I'm sorry for interrupting, but this has really been a bit of a stick in my craw because, normally when you get a deal, you got a deal, and that's just simply was not the case this year.
Yeah, thank you. So Sarah, appreciate the question. And we can provide the data that might be instructive as well as you get a feel when you're voting on bill after bill and you're saying, normally when we're here, and we certainly have things we disagree on, but typically if you did, and they're usually pretty sharp disagreements, or often pretty sharp disagreements, but they're by far the minority. And there's a lot of stuff we have done historically that is bipartisan, but you just look at the numbers, the number of bills that passed on sharp partisan votes, it's just quite a lot higher this year than it has been in the past. And I think there's a number of things that contribute to that, and that doesn't take away from the bipartisan work that was done. You mentioned several, whether it's forests or the working family tax credit that I think Republicans, frankly, drove to the table, which I'm personally very proud of, or the work, the DD work that happened inside the budget. Again, personally very proud of and proud of the Republicans for driving that issue to the top. But then you start looking at all the things that were sharply partisan and frankly didn't need to be. And I would make the case shouldn't have been. We talked earlier about police reform. That was an issue many of us cared deeply about, and there was no significant opportunity on the major reform bills to have any bipartisan dialogue. You know, it was what was being done to police officers, not for them, and it was just sharply divided. Is one example. Of course, taxes we're gonna disagree on. That should be no surprise to anyone. But what was frankly pretty surprising was the willingness to impose highly regressive taxes without any significant dialogue. And I could go on, and we'll send out to the group afterwards if you'd like kind of the numbers that show. But we think the initial numbers show we're about 2 to 2.5 times more partisan bills this session than we've seen in the past. And I think one is because the majority came to town with a caucus that is further to the left than they have been in the past, and with a very clear agenda to get certain things done that were highly partisan. And then and the knowledge that there wasn't a lot of interaction with the public to stop them. And then frankly, and I would say in fairness, a little bit of it is, but I deliver the credit to them for this too, is the fact that we kept legislators largely out of Olympia, largely from talking to one another. You didn't have any of those conversations that turned a partisan bill that had second and third order effects to our communities into a bipartisan bill. It just didn't happen. And whether that was because we couldn't, because not everybody was there, or because there was a lack of desire to do that by the majority, I couldn't tell you with certainty. But I would just put that forward as part of the reason we ended up where we ended up, and the numbers show a very partisan session.
And I would say that there's another measure as well, not just the number of bills, not just how the votes look, but the distance away from the center that the bills went, and the incredible cost imposed on people that have to commute. You know, this interface of the unaffordable nature of housing in urban areas and adding so much to the future cost of fuel for working people. I think it's really, really hard for me to get away from the impact that that's going to have on so many people. And at the same time, as we heard unending rhetoric about progressive goals and the regressive nature of our tax system. And then in the last couple of days to deliver that to people that are struggling and had been told that they were going to be the object of concern. And were told that they were going to get a lot of help out of this session. And in the end, such a devastating blow that I think is going to change lives in the long run.
And Sarah, if I could just add on to that, the effect of eyeballs in the room. I came from local government. Eyeballs in the room, your constituents up close and personal, staring you in the face, makes it really hard to vote on issues that are counter to their needs. So I think it had a huge effect that we were isolated. Very easy to vote against what your constituents might want when they're not there staring you in the face. So I think that has had a great effect. And when we get the numbers out to you on the percentage of bipartisan versus very partisan bills today, I think you're going to be surprised. But I think that's the reason. The public wasn't there to stare us in the face and make us do the right thing.
Sarah, did you have a follow-up question?
Yes, so those numbers that you're referring to, after hearing your answers there, do you think, obviously we can't see the work that goes on behind the scenes. So do you think the final maybe percentage of partisan bills more so just reflects the magnitude, these big issues, and like, could that have been changed, or does it actually reflect a lack of collaboration behind the scenes?
I think it's absolutely a reflection of the lack of collaboration. and whether that, I think there was reasonably some question about whether that's because we weren't all physically together or because there was a highly partisan agenda coming into the session. Either way, that accrues to the majority who restricted access, and I think arguably came with a highly partisan agenda. So impossible to tell break those down into exact weights, but they both clearly were the top contributing factors.
Okay, we'll go to Drew Nicholson with King 5. Go ahead, Drew.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for making time for us today. We have been hearing so much about this capital gains tax that this is not an income tax, and I'll leave that argument for another day. But what about the fears that this would just be the beginning? Is there any doubt in any of your minds that this limited scope that we have right now will be expanded?
Drew, the governor's own budget says he wants it at 9% on $25,000. I mean, that's in his own words and writing. This income tax is, in their words, to provide childcare access that doesn't increase childcare anywhere in the state of Washington, especially my district. I don't see any additional slots being opened, and we are in a childcare crisis. I mean, this is ridiculous. Let's talk about the cure. And the cure is we need more open slots for childcare, but we don't need an income tax to solve the problem. We need to talk about the problem. I get a little frustrated when we talk about increasing gas prices, which, by the way, increases food costs. I mean, I think we need to talk about that if we're going to actually produce food in the state of Washington. But we continue to have a housing crisis, a food crisis. Where economy is suffering, people are suffering. And then these are policies that have been enacted in quite a few in the last few years that has caused these problems, the increase in cost. And now the legislature wants to sell you the cure, and the cure is more taxes. I mean, you create the problem, and now you're trying to sell them the cure, which is more. Yeah, there's a problem. Let's solve that problem.
Yeah, I think there can be no doubt that this is a prelude to more. And I would just go back to the insistence on either emergency clause or when they failed to get the votes for that, a hidden referendum ban that's written into this. There was an absolute insistence in the end that they would not pass this in a way that would allow a referendum. And there's a simple reason for that, and they're pretty plain. They want this to be, to go to legal challenge, and they want time before the people weigh in and undo this, which I'm confident they will, for the Supreme Court to rule. They want the ruling that says that an income tax is allowed constitutionally in the state of Washington, so that they can roll out a bigger plan. And it's plain from the words they said. It's plain from the language they insisted on, and it's plain from the fact that, look, the majority just passed nearly a $60 billion budget. This bill brings in $500 million. They got a lot of room to grow to cover more and more of their special needs as they grow the budget. It's very clear what they're willing to take even the political heat of restricting access of the voters to undo this, because they need that, and they believe they'll get it, the ruling from the Supreme Court that allows for a graduated income tax, and then they can go forward with the rest of their plan that taxes all of us, from in every economic spectrum more. It's that simple.
Yeah, Drew, I mean, count how many times the legislature has reduced taxes. We reduced property taxes in my area, my first year in the legislature, and the next year when Democrats took control of everything, they promptly raised them again. There is a pattern of taxes only ever going up, but you don't have to take our word for it or conjecture. The chair of the Senate Law and Justice Committee, who is, I don't agree with him on much, but he is undoubtedly one of the smartest guys in that building, said as much. He said in emails to his constituents multiple times, the whole point of the capital gains tax isn't just a capital gains tax, it's to lay the foundation for a legal challenge so the court can overturn their prior holdings that treat income as property. That's it. That's the goal for a bunch of folks. That's why Republicans have been opposing it, because it is step one to institute a broad-based income tax.
The first question I got yesterday when leaving the House floor was, oh, are we going to start reducing the B&O tax for small businesses to start building them up after COVID recession? We're going to start, reducing property taxes for people who've been suffering. No. Well, they said, well, we passed a capital gains income tax. Isn't that going to happen? No. Nothing's being reduced.
And I'll point out too, Drew, again, not rhetoric, the capital gains tax was wholly unnecessary, and happy to walk you through the Democrats' budget document that shows it in 2 simple lines. The third line on the budget outlook takes away $1.4 billion out of the budget that we're statutorily entitled to assume. A few more lines down, we add in a capital gains tax that raises $1.2 billion. So we're bringing in $1.2 billion in taxes, but we're intentionally excluding $1.4 billion of revenue we're allowed to count. Simply not necessary. It's by choice alone, and it's because the folks want to set up a challenge to the constitutional holding that income is property.
And we know, Drew, we now have the most activist Supreme Court in the history of our state. We saw that with State v. Blake. And Drew, I also would like to add, it's really nice to see your face. Thanks for turning your camera on.
Drew, I just add that this is all being done against the backdrop of a tax policy work group that's supposed to be working together to come up with solutions that are better for Washington State. So it feels very insincere that they dump all of these tax increases in this session while supposedly working together with me. I'm the co-chair of the tax structure work group, and all of this is like an ambush. It doesn't make me feel confident that the tax structure work group is going to get to real bipartisan solutions, which is the stated intent of that body.
Hey, Drew, did you have a follow-up?
I'm good for today. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And next we will go to Michael Goldberg from Washington State Wire.
Thank you. This question is for Senator Braun and Representative Wilcox. Neither caucus was able to mount a strong enough opposition to prevent the majority's big ticket agenda items from passing, but there also wasn't unanimous Democratic support for several of these bills. So based on your assessment of where the Democratic caucuses are and the manner in which they proceeded in passing policy this session, what do you see as the key ingredient or set of ingredients to narrowing majorities going forward?
Well, I think the fact that they're implementing an agenda that I don't think the majority of Washington agrees with, and certainly is going to make it much more difficult to have a middle-class suburban lifestyle is probably the thing that is going to do the trick. We've seen this over and over across the country, and in Washington, big majorities inevitably overreach, and there's an inevitable backlash. And I think that you will see that next session. Not we don't have an election between now and then, but I think that as people go home and get the feedback that has not been easy to get during this session, they will come back next session and feel a lot more moderate and feeling the need to appeal to the broad middle of the citizens of Washington.
Yeah, I think that we have some work to do to communicate the things that the majorities did this session and why it's bad for Washingtonians across the state, that it's simply making it more and more unaffordable to live in the state of Washington. And I think when people realize that, and then we show that we can stay focused on what I think are the core things. And this is not a newsflash. It's jobs, good family-based jobs, education, keeping our education system funded properly. And by the way, $60 billion budget, we still managed to let education funding, public education funding, fall below 50% down to 47% this year. So we're seeing the same things we've seen before. When you have Democratic majorities, they talk about education, but they fail to fund it. And then the third thing I would add in there is just a sustainable budget. You know, the average Washingtonian doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about the state's budget, and it's sometimes hard to message, but they expect us to do a reasonable and responsible job and make sure that we don't overspend, that we don't continually come back for them for more and more money. And so I think if we get out and share that message with Washingtonians, particularly I think in the suburbs for us is important, that we're trying to just make life better for you and your family, that we'll get a positive response. So that's our challenge, is to get out there and share that, and we'll see what happens. The other thing I'd mention is you talked about some of these key bills not passing with the full, at least in the Senate, the full 28 Democratic votes. We worked really hard this session to talk to our colleagues where we could, and as I mentioned before, we couldn't always do that, to build philosophical majorities and build relationships across the aisle that helps keep politics in the state of Washington down the middle. And we obviously weren't as successful as I would have liked to be, and I'd like to be at least one vote more successful on the capital gains income tax that passed by one, or I think the cap and tax also passed by one, and stop those policies. I think will be very harmful to our state. But we'll continue that work. We'll continue to build relationships and philosophical majorities where we can, and we'll share the results of the current majority's work with the people of the state of Washington. And I think they will respond by giving us more opportunity to be impactful in the future.
Okay, thank you. And next we'll go with Joe O'Sullivan with the Seattle Times.
I have two questions. First, for Representative Wilcox, you mentioned bills was something like drifting away from the center. I'd be curious to hear an example or two that fit that category for you. And then the second question for whoever, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Democrats don't have the 60% threshold themselves to do a new transportation bonding bill for a new package. So does that leave Republicans any kind of leverage, considering the clean fuels and the cap and trade, I believe, are both contingent on that package?
Okay, the first part of your question, I would say drifting away from the center. Exhibit A is the full meal deal that we're talking about, really almost declaring war on people that are not able to afford housing close to their work. Piling those three policies, one on top of the other, potentially three with a transportation package sometime in the future, that's never been done before. This is so far beyond the ambitions of any majority in the past. Think about the gas tax packages in the past. There was the nickel, there was the dime. Can you imagine 5 years ago talking about, we're going to have a 60-cent tax, or we're going to have a $1 tax? No majority would have survived that in the past, and I don't think it will this time if people are able to look at the impact. Another policy where I think they drifted away from the center, and I actually want to go back to Essex's question a little bit too, because I regret that I didn't say something. Public safety. I think many people believe that we've gone too far in the direction of making it very difficult for police to keep people safe. The goal is important. Nobody disagrees at this point that we have had all kinds of inequality and legal malpractice in the past. And we've seen these examples thanks to citizens with cell phones that now make it impossible not to face the fact that there have been bad actors, and probably more than we knew about in the past. But the reaction, I think many people are going to see, has gone too far. And one of the bipartisan hopes that I have for the future is that we will stress test these bills over the next few months and come back even next session and try to figure out what worked and what didn't, because the consequences are pretty high when you're talking about making such major changes to public safety. The rewards are high too. if we get it right. We do not want to go forward and see things like happened with the Derek Chauvin case. But I would really look forward to bipartisan stress testing and sort of reevaluating, is there a way to get this better based on experience? And yes, I think that if there is a desire on the part of the majority party and the governor to have a special session, first, I'd like everybody to go back and review what the governor said about special sessions when we proposed them. I think he said some things that maybe he'd regret if he wants to come back in and do a special session, because he laughed at us and questioned our motives in doing that. It is going to take Republican votes if they are going to do a bond. And I would suggest that if there are some things that we can do jointly that are good for the whole state, building hard assets for the economy, we're really open to talking about that. But it absolutely has to be something that's good across the whole state and is not going to crush people that just want to have a middle-class life. And that requires commuting for affordable housing.
Okay. And next I will go to Leo Brine from Publicola.
Thanks, Kim. I wanted to ask, the Democrats yesterday during their press conference said they want to continue the use of virtual testimony in public hearings. I wanted to know what you guys think about that.
Senate has been supporting virtual testimony for nearly 10 years, since the beginning of the majority coalition caucus. We've encouraged this. We've pushed hard for it. Now, we've made a big leap in the last year, certainly, but it's not a new direction for us. So I expect that will continue. It allows people additional access from around the state where they have to travel long distances. I would just submit that that's not a substitute. It's not a substitute for the allowance of in-person testimony, allowance for people to come and talk in person to their legislators and for legislators to talk to each other in person.
Yeah, I hope that we continue this, but we've got to find a way to balance this a little bit. I don't think it was very helpful for anybody to have long hearings with people getting 30 seconds or 60 seconds. That wasn't quality input. And I think that the process suffered because of that. So one more thing has been stress test, and we got to find ways to improve that.
Leo, did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, on a different subject. Given that there are all these new taxes that'll raise fuel prices, I wanted to know, do you think Washingtonians are going to need a minimum wage increase in order to keep up with all these raises in fuel prices?
Well, Leo, we not only did we raise taxes on every single taxpayer in our state in this legislative session, we also significantly raised taxes on our businesses. Except if you're a foreign-owned oil company, then you're in very good shape. But the fact of the matter is that business has been our goose that lays the golden egg. They are job creators. They contribute significantly to our economy in B&O, and we're starting to see some of the outcome of Boeing's departure. So I think to say to the businesses, now you're going to have to increase your minimum wage again. I can tell you, in the interim, I work at a golf course, minimum wage earner, and they had to let a few of us go when the last increase happened. So now there are 3 people who don't have a job so that 12 other people can keep their job. And those are the kinds of decisions that business people have to make. So I think if we really want to talk about progressive tax policy, the very best thing we can do is get rid of the taxes on the people who can ill afford to pay them. And we had several bills this session that would have done just exactly that. We of course drove the working families tax credit. That was huge. But we also had bills that did things like got rid of the taxes on diapers, both for seniors and for those young families who are just starting off with infants. And so those would be dollars that would go back into the economy and drive our economy towards greater prosperity. But that was never ever the solution. It was, and you know, I think it was Representative Maycomber pointed out, look, these transportation packages or these carbon bills, they're going to increase the price of every single thing from food to the merchandise that we get. I anticipate we're going to see the end of free delivery from Amazon because if they're paying $1 to $2 more per gallon just in tax, the numbers start to grow significantly. But the other piece of it is, and don't forget this, the food stock that will need to be used in order to create the additive for gasoline for the low carbon fuel standard. You know what, Leo, that takes food off the tables of the people of our state. We're choosing between feeding people and creating a low carbon fuel standard, which actually is not going to make any cleaner tailpipes, just so people know that. It doesn't improve the CO2 emission, it merely drives up the cost. So people have to find other ways to go than driving in their gas-powered vehicle.
Hey, Leo, the best way of increasing wages for people at the low end of the scale is to have a strong economy, even a hot economy that drives wage growth. And we saw that. In fact, we were seeing it move way faster than minimum wage increases up until COVID and the lockdowns. And I think if we adopt policies that are pro-growth, you're going to see wage growth go through the roof.
And Leo, to build a little bit on what Senator Rivers said, one of the fails, or at least not a complete win in this budget, was not reloading our unemployment insurance trust fund the way we should have done it. So that burden, we did a little bit of relief by kicking the can down the road, but those businesses are going to be paying huge increases in unemployment benefits. So I felt like we really missed an opportunity, while at the same time that budget carves out kind of $1 billion on the side that's being held that came out of our rainy day fund, the budget stabilization account. We should have used that money to do good for our small businesses so they can afford to stay in business and have employees at all. The idea of increasing a minimum wage, it may have some merit some places, but if there's not a business there to pay the wage at all, then we all lose.
Okay, I'm going to see if I can get to a few more questions here. Let's see, Keith Eldridge with Como, go ahead.
Hi, a couple of questions regarding the drug possession bill that passed dealing with Blake. What's your reaction to that? And also your continued concern of the governor's metrics that several counties are poised to go back 1 week from today to phase 2, including King, Snohomish, Lewis, Yakima. Two questions there, thanks.
I'll jump in on the bill to address the Blake decision. You know, as I stated pretty clearly on the floor, I think that was absolutely the wrong direction. I appreciate some of the earlier work we did in the Senate. It was very bipartisan. You saw it come out on an even split from each side. And none of us loved it entirely, but it was a much better solution for the state of Washington. It had a real diversion program that helped folks get into treatment more quickly, but also allowed prosecutors some leverage to keep them in treatment, as opposed to what ultimately was passed, which is a referral system that I don't think there's a single law enforcement officer in the state that understands how that's going to work. They are, when they find someone in possession, they're supposed to pick them up and give them a ride to a treatment facility, hope they go to a treatment facility. Nobody gets it. There's no enforcement mechanism whatsoever. And we know from experience, and frankly, we know from folks that called me and lots of other legislatures without some level of law enforcement involvement, and these folks will not make it. It's as simple as that. We also saw that it went from a gross misdemeanor down to a misdemeanor, which I don't think the goal here is to keep folks in jail at all. The goal here is to give prosecutors the leverage they need to keep people in treatment, help them get back on their feet, get away from the substance challenges, abuse challenges that they have, and get back to productive lives. And we just reduce the tools for prosecutors and law enforcement around the state. And then finally, and perhaps most egregiously, it sunsets back into current law, which means under the Blake decision, it sunsets back to full legalization of hard drugs. And it just doesn't make sense to me why we want to go down that path. Now, I'm not a big fan of the historic war on drugs. I think we got it wrong in many ways. But I do believe you have to have some level, some leverage for law enforcement and prosecutors who, by the way, regardless of where they're from, here in my county, that's very, counties that are very conservative, they are completely focused on treatment. They're not focused on getting and keeping people in jail because they know if they just do that, they'll just be back. They are focused on getting them treatment, but they need the tools to get them treatment. And the idea that somehow if we just make it legal, it'll all be okay, I think is just wrongheaded. And will lead, as I said, to people dying. It's tragic what we're doing. So that's what I think about that. And I honestly don't remember. I got so excited about this question. I honestly don't remember your second question.
It had to do with the metrics you advocated for instead of cases and hospitalizations per 100,000.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And
so
capacity.
I remember now. So I would tell you that, I mean, we continue to have this challenge we've had for a year now with a public health department, a Department of Health getting the metrics quite right and timely. And I recognize they have a significant challenge, but we haven't quite risen to that challenge. But more importantly, we failed over and over, and currently we're failing again to think about what our situation is and how it's changed from before. So last time we had a surge, we didn't have the virus, right? And that means we had to pay attention to case rate and hospitalization, and fatalities tracked that very well. What we see now is when case rate is going up, the mortality rate is not going up at the same rate. We have people with vaccines. We know that our most vulnerable population, 65 and over, are 75% vaccinated. We know the real mortality risk is significantly reduced because of that. So we can have different policies. I think it's time we stopped. And I don't want to stop looking at case rate, but I think we got to start putting more weight on fatality rate or mortality rate, and to a certain extent, we should keep a close eye on hospital availability. But instead, we're just using the same old metrics the same old way and not adapting to what our situation is right now.
And you meant to say before we had the vaccine. You said before we had the virus.
Yeah, you're right. Thank you for editing me. I meant before we had the vaccine. Thank you.
Keith, since I represent parts of two of the counties you mentioned, King and Snohomish County, there's a problem with the one size fits all and treating a whole area as if it's exactly the same. I have long been speaking that it should be turned to the counties to make these decisions on their own. And the counties have multiple county commissioners or county council members for a reason, because what's happening in Sultan and Granite Falls and Gold Bar, Snohomish County, is not the same thing that's happening in Everett, Snohomish County. So we should quit applying these one size fits all solutions. We should cede some of that power and decision making back to local authorities, because they're going to do what's right for their people. They're the closest to the people. And I would like to see the governor acknowledge that. And it's part of what's wrong with the idea of regionalizing our health districts. It just takes a big chunk of geographical area without regard to how the people live and work in those areas.
Thank you.
Okay, and next we will go to Jerry Cornfield from the Everett Herald. Go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah, two questions. First, the Senate majority and minority leaders. I wonder if you could tell us how many times in the session did you speak with or meet with the governor, and how many four-corner meetings you had with your colleagues and the other. And the second question, with the transportation package, typically we hear one legislature cannot obligate future legislatures, but the low carbon fuel and cap and trade bills do appear to require a future legislature to pass a 5-cent gas tax hike as part of a revenue package. So I'm wondering, do you think that violates laws, and should the governor veto it?
Well, easy question. How often do we meet with the governor? We up until the last couple weeks, at which point we stopped having meetings for reasons I don't understand. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but prior to that, we met with the governor and his staff about every 2 weeks, and I would tell you they were generally pretty cordial meetings. I've had a lot of meetings with the governor over the time he and I have both been in office, and they weren't always cordial. So I give him credit. We didn't convince him to change his mindset on certain policies, but it was a positive dialogue for what it's worth. And I do think we had some influence on convincing him to help us get kids back in school. And I appreciate the fact that he responded to that argument and saw the wisdom of it. So, and then the last 2 weeks went pretty quiet across the board, which is unfortunate. As far as four-corner meetings, I can, and JT may remember something else or others. I only remember one, and that had to do with a security briefing we had that essentially told us all that we didn't need a fence, but the majorities of the governor were unwilling to act on that guidance.
Yeah, we follow the same pattern with the governor as the Senate did, and those were cordial meetings. And actually, I think we decided this time we were going to try to deliberately find some things that would be easier to work together on. And one of the things we talked about very early on was wildfires and the need for a major effort. And that there probably is no more significant environmental bill this year than that one, if it's successful, and if proper forest practices are going to make the same impact on state forests as they have clearly made on private forests. That's a huge success, and nobody understands that it's an environmental bill more than anything else. Lori and I have a every 2 week formal meeting scheduled, but there are quite a few just stroll across or behind the rostrum and go visit on things. Sometimes it's social, sometimes it's because there's a problem, but more often it's just a quick checkup, an update of some kind. Didn't have formal meetings with Andy Billig, but I did give him a call a few times on some things that we thought were important, and have always had a good relationship with him too. And I totally forgot that four-corner Zoom that John mentioned, or maybe it was a Microsoft Teams. To me, it's still not a meeting if it's not face-to-face, but we did have that. And I even had an hour yesterday or the day before with the lieutenant governor, who's a little bit of an old friend. And that was a great visit, social as well as a little bit of business involved.
Yeah, I would just, I didn't hear the question that way. We did have every 2 week meetings, formal meetings, virtual meetings with the Senate Democratic leadership, and then I had many calls and direct conversations with masks and social distancing with Senator Billig while we were on the floor.
Jerry, did you have a follow-up?
Just interested in the language linking those bills with a nickel gas tax increase, if you think that might violate the laws, and whether the governor should try to find a way to veto it or not.
Well, I don't think it violates any laws. Understand that they don't prevent a future legislature from just changing that. So a future legislature wants to do as I hope they will, a transportation package based on sales tax on motor vehicles, they can simply build it into the bill to undo that connection. They, for that matter, could completely undo the cap and tax bill or the low carbon fuel standard, known as the high cost fuel standard, should they choose to. So I don't think there's anything illegal or improper. Maybe, well, improper because of a policy concern, but not improper from a statutory concern. Future legislatures could just change the statute.
Okay, and our final question today comes from Mario Lotmore from the Linwood Times. Go ahead, Mario.
Hello, Mario Lotmore here with the Linwood Times. My questions are for Wilcox, Maycomer, and probably Ron. We'll see. Here's my question for Representative Maycomer. You voted for HB 5476. What are your thoughts on the passing of HB 5476? And what are potential unforeseen consequences, both positive and negative, by the passage of the bill?
Well, I'm looking that up really fast because I know the numbers in my head.
It's the Blake bill.
Oh, it's the Blake bill.
Oh, the Blake bill. Okay, so you said yes. So you know, Senator Braun made really showing the differences between what was in front of us and what was available to vote on. And I did vote for the policy because we were in dire straits, leaving people with zero options and having drugs available for even children right now is just not acceptable to leave the legislature at this time. So I did vote for a policy that was better than allowing, you know, children as young as 12 or 14 with fentanyl or, you know, heavy drugs. We have to do something. I did vote for the policy on the striker, that was the Goodman striker ahead of us. As a law enforcement officer, you see lives destroyed with drug use. You see lives in the future of generations destroyed. So we do have to do something. Is it enough? No. Is it what we need to do now and what was available at the time? Yes. And so I did vote for that. I fear that, you know, all communities are touched by substance abuse disorders, but you really see with the combination of what occurred in the legislature this year, our poorest communities affected the most. And when you talk about the increase in gas taxes, LCSF, cap and tax, housing crisis, energy cost crisis, a lot of these things are going to be coming to fruition as we exit this post-COVID economy. And I really fear with public safety, in addition, you really see the poorest communities suffering the most when we will be done with this legislative process.
All right, thank you. Representative Wilcox, you voted against HB 5476. Would you like to share your thoughts on the passing of 5476 and any potential unforeseen consequences?
Yeah, sure. I was hoping that a mixed vote would send a message to the Senate Democrats that they should adhere to the policy that was formed in kind of an unusual bipartisan way on the floor. The Senate policy was a better policy. I honor Jacqueline's reasons because there were not great choices, but I was looking for a third way and hoping to incentivize that.
Okay. Senator Braun, with May 3rd Healthy Washington evaluation just around the corner, both King and Snohomish County, mainly King, are at risk of reverting to phase 2. If more counties revert to phase 2, would the legislature consider not extending the governor's emergency powers or call for a special session?
Well, unfortunately, we closed her down yesterday, and the majorities refused to make any effort to reform the emergency powers. The Republicans, both in the Senate and the House, tried repeatedly to get that on the list of things to do this session. The majorities refused that. Not only that, early in the session, they extended all the proclamations by the governor, not just for 30 or 60 or 90 days, but until he decides there's no longer an emergency. So yes, we will continue to push for that to happen, but the legislative majorities, Democratic majorities, have said they're not interested in this. And so I think at this point, it's up to the people to decide at the ballot box how this should be handled. And I don't mean an initiative. I mean, they got to decide if they're pleased with the majorities making that decision.
Thank you.
All right, that concludes our questions. Senator Braun or Representative Wilcox, do either of you have any parting words before we finish for today?
No parting words for me.
I would just say, and we talked about some of this, and as you might imagine, we're a little bit down on the session. There's a lot of heavy, hard left partisan agenda items that made it through. But I would also take credit for some of the things we did do from the Republican side. I believe we drove the discussion on business reopening, and we didn't get everything we wanted, but we got the discussion going, and we got some of the way down the road. We drove the discussion on getting our kids back into classroom for in-person learning, and we've again, not on the timeline we would have liked, but people aren't talking about not being in school next fall any longer. And I think that's a result of our insistence that we're doing harm to these children by keeping them out of school. So I'm proud of that. We also saw some stuff that the working families tax credit that Drew Stokesbury really led on. That made it into the final budget in large part because Republicans pushed on that idea early. We saw something not many people pay attention to, but I certainly do as a former budget person, is the early pay down of our long-term pension liability for TERS 1. Great move, great financial move. And that came directly out of the Republican budgets. It wouldn't have happened if it weren't for us. We talked about forced health. That was led by Republicans. We talked about the investment in services for developmentally disabled citizens. That was led with Republican efforts. Even from the minority, I think we have a lot that we affected the discussion and we got it done. And while we are deeply unpleased with some of the things that came out of this session, we're also proud of the places that we fought and changed the dialogue and got positive change for the state of Washington. So that's all I got for today. I appreciate everybody's attendance. I look forward to having these in person in coming weeks or years, hopefully weeks, but more like months, I guess, somewhere in between. So I'll sign off from there.
Thank you everyone for joining us. And if you need any additional resources on the messaging today, just give me a call. Thanks.